Salvage is something of a buzzword in the two fields I move through most frequently, and it is understood in radically different ways. On one hand, in Native American and Indigenous studies, salvage is a rightfully despised concept and practice. It evokes grave robbing, generations of gawking anthropologists, and ultimately the vanishing race hypothesis that still dominates popular US beliefs about the eventual drawn out death of Indigenous peoples under settler colonialism. On the other hand, in the history of science, especially post-colonial and science and technology studies, salvage is the subversive domain of the Global South. It is the ingenious practice of repairing and recycling technologies deemed too old or too dirty by a wasteful global north, and even more so, salvage is the process by which the post-colony has accessed and made use of its own material pasts. In both spaces, salvage is an environmental technology. It is the process by which lands are made to give way to development and anthropogenic change, and it is the way the past is extracted from the landscape as a resource. In other words, salvage is the scientific method of transforming the way we move through and regard landscapes. And it is one method by which the historicity underlying that movement is conceived and reproduced. That the settler and post-colonial embrace of salvage as a nation-building technology dovetail in this way is no coincidence. Salvage was hotly debated and gatekept during the 1960s by US settler scientists, and it was a key theme in post-colonial discourse during the same period. Today, I'm going to outline how archaeologists in the United States developed an anachronistic science of salvage in the midst of the Cold War. This was in self-conscious contrast to archaeologists in post-colonial North Africa as they undertook their own salvage projects in advance of the construction of the Aswan Dam. The methodology of settler archaeologists positioned salvage as a frontier technology that could enable an anachronistic periodization underscoring settler originality. United Arab Republic scientists, on the other hand, worked according to a method that rendered their nation-states as geographic and historical centers after centuries of inhabiting an imposed periphery. In 1965, archaeologist Frederick Johnson published the article Archaeology in Emergency in Science. He wrote, quote, "Everyone is familiar with the spectacular archaeology now in progress on the Upper Nile in areas where the reservoir is to be created by the Aswan Dam. Here, whole temples are being moved to higher levels, and even more importantly, archaeologists are recording the long prehistory of the Nile River Valley before it goes underwater. It was not common knowledge prior to this emergency that the prehistory of the region extends back into Paleolithic times. Probably less well known, at least less dramatically publicized, is the fact that within the United States, the federal government has been conducting since 1947 an interagency archaeological salvage program. This was designed initially to salvage materials to be destroyed by the construction of multi-purpose dams in all parts of the nation. The results may not be as spectacular as those coming from the old world, but they are fully as valuable, for they document a significant part of the long human occupation of the New World." End quote. This 1947 origin that he references is actually on par with the development of salvage as a science internationally. Mid-century industrial acceleration had put many sites of archaeological interest, by which I primarily mean the historical heritage sites of Black and Brown people, had been put in danger, and this was even more so the case in the Global South, where post-colonial nations were tasked with protecting their own heritage from developing global inequities of production and industrialization. However, despite this common trajectory, John Otis Brew, then the director of the Harvard Peabody Museum, had insisted only 2 years earlier, in 1963, that the global origin of salvage archaeology should be rightfully traced not to the international movement and mid-century acceleration and to dam projects at the same time, but instead to Thomas Jefferson's work excavating native burial mounds near Monticello in the 18th century, some hundreds of years earlier. What the Archaeology in Emergency article belies, namely the insecurity about the spectacle of the ancient artifacts of the Old World compared to the New, was ultimately eclipsed in US science publications, not only by these claims to early Republic settler colonial salvage projects that appropriated the ancientness of indigeneity in the supposedly New World, but also by critiques of the sentimentality of the method of Old World scientists. On this point, ethnologist James T. Hester, the following year, offered this assessment, quote, "The concept of archaeological salvage in the past 20 years in the United States has changed somewhat through time. Initially, salvage was thought to require few changes in technique, with the major effort being placed on wise selection of the endangered sites to be studied. The techniques to be employed at these selected sites were the traditional ones dictated by the training the researcher had acquired. Through time, it became apparent that a better sample could be acquired by digging more sites rapidly than by digging a few sites with great care. The use of power equipment became commonplace, and techniques of field recovery and laboratory analysis became geared to need for greater speed and standardization. It is interesting to contrast the evolution in techniques described above with those utilized by some of the salvage teams from other countries working in the Aswan Reservoir. A common theme emphasized by many of the latter, primarily those researchers with a background in classical archaeology, was that the salvage situation made possible legalized looting. The concern was not for obtaining a broader informational sample, but instead for the collection of a larger sample of art objects. The result was that the larger sample had less data recovered to document each object, and many items of artistic merit were completely ignored." End quote. If Hester is to be taken at his word, and I'll add that that is not an insignificant or even likely if clause, then why was there a supposedly unscientific concern about legalized looting in Egypt? And why was there a seemingly methodological failure to collect not only the right objects, but to categorize and contextualize them properly? Why was there too much care? Ultimately, the Oswai High Dam project meant to establish a very different kind of landscape with vastly different historical stakes than those of the US landscapes referenced earlier. The Aswan High Dam project, as part of the post-1952 Egyptian Revolution, and more specifically as part of the post-1956 Nasser presidency, was the result of a campaign for agrarian reform and industrialization, and it was part and parcel of the post-colonial nation building in the region during this time period. Salvage of sites and artifacts slated to be flooded was conceptually and financially key to that project, which would reclaim and reimagine Egyptian history and the erection of post-colonial industrial modernity and independence. However, as was often the case, the United Arab Republic was forced into a position of reliance on largely European-led international organizations to fund the project, and archaeologists paid a high price for aid and collaboration with UNESCO members on the project. The British and French invested quite a bit, both in terms of money and scientists from their own nations, in a thinly veiled bid at securing renewed access to colonial excavation sites lost in post-colonial independence, while Sudan and the United Arab Republic were expected to issue asset repayments with interest. The United Arab Republic was expected to provide, quote, "no less than 50% of the finds excavated in Nubia, authorization to carry out further excavations in other parts of Egypt, and the cession of precious objects and monuments, including certain Nubian temples, for transfer abroad," end quote. While Sudan, quote, "for its part offered 50% of the finds from excavations made in its entire territory," end quote. The result of this was that items and sites were indeed being looted, even if the projects were directed and enacted by North African hands. The methods employed at the Aswan High Dam were far more ambivalent than those all-encompassing ones heralded by settler authorities as high data and scientific. Furthermore, the United States was not a member of UNESCO at the time, and accordingly did not benefit from nor impact the method of colonial mining and post-colonial reclaiming of Egyptian sites. The degree to which jealousy was a part of their refashioning of salvage as an American science is not to be understated. Salvage was never just about the systematic study and collection of objects at risk of extinction or being destroyed. It was instead a methodology and a toolkit which involved a quantitative, data-driven method that disciplined very specific ways of seeing and assigning value to objects and landscapes. For settler archaeologists working on stolen indigenous land, salvage was a means of data collection that privileged breadth and speed and was to a certain extent blind to the cultural value of objects in and of themselves. It was a method of knowledge production that worked precisely because it was a spatial and cultural transgression upon indigenous people and land relations. This focus on speed and scope is a marker of settler frontier sciences that had developed over the course of the 19th century on the North American continental frontier and was being reimagined in the 20th century, and especially in the midst of the Cold War, through the process of what Choctaw theorist Jody Bird calls transit, the use of Indianness, and I would add the spatial use of frontier, as a point through which the settler empire makes itself, and I would add makes spaces and peoples prone to colonization, as the US was then projecting upon North Africa and the Middle East. The US used salvage as a tool to create frontiers and anachronism as a tool to create a historicity in which it was always first. The use of salvage as a spatial and geographic tool is not unique. Indeed, you can see the same process in post-colonial North Africa. The epistemological difference between the two, by which I mean the methods and values, did indeed create different spaces, however. The science of salvage depended on how its practices could create a frontier, and it could create a frontier as easily as it could create a pioneer, and at the same time, salvage could be used to challenge a center, to make a periphery, and to construct a post-colonial subject.